Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It was just past 5 on a breezy Thursday evening when I stepped outside with a cup of chamomile tea, hoping the cool air would soothe the restlessness that had settled in my chest all week. Our neighborhood was quiet, tucked into the edge of town like a forgotten bookmark in an old novel, mostly retirees, some families, and the occasional visiting grandchild shouting in the cul-de-sac. I liked the calm, the routine of it, but sometimes the silence pressed in too tightly. I sat on the front porch, the wood beneath me still warm from the day's sun. Across the street, I noticed the lights flicker on in Margaret's house. Margaret was my neighbor, sweet and chatty, always handing over zucchini from her garden or a slice of banana bread wrapped in wax paper. We often traded stories and casseroles like we were characters in a storybook. But that evening, it wasn't Margaret I saw. It was her brother, Dennis. He'd been staying with her for a few days, something about recovering from a recent divorce, though I hadn't pried. I'd only met him briefly once, a polite wave while I was unloading groceries. Tall, reserved, with graying temples and a kind of sadness behind his eyes that felt like it had been there too long. That evening, he stood on her porch, looking like he wanted to go somewhere but couldn't quite make himself take the first step. I watched him for a moment longer, then turned my attention back to the steam rising from my mug. That's when I heard footsteps crossing the street, slow but steady. I looked up, and there he was, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed like a man carrying a question too heavy to carry alone. "Hi," he said, voice soft. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," I replied, sitting up straighter. "Would you like to sit?" He hesitated, then nodded. I motioned to the empty rocking chair beside mine, and he settled in with a sigh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep. "I'm Dennis," he said, as if we hadn't already exchanged names. "I remember." "I'm Ellen." I smiled gently, watching him glance around like he didn't know what to do with his hands. He nodded again, then fell quiet. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves overhead and making the wind chime above my door tinkle softly. I didn't push. Sometimes silence tells more than words can. Eventually, he spoke. "I saw you out here earlier this week, just sitting. You looked peaceful." I chuckled softly. It's my little escape. Tea, porch, and no news for a while. He gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been trying to figure out how to talk to someone again. Just talk, without worrying how it will be taken, without the filters." I tilted my head, studying him. "This porch doesn't require filters." He looked at me then, really looked, like he was assessing whether he could trust that. "I've made a mess of things," he said quietly. "I spent years building a life that ended with a text message and a lock change. 40 years old and starting over like I'm 20 again." I let that settle. Margaret mentioned something about a divorce. Yeah, 23 years gone. And now I'm staying in her guest room, feeling like a stranger to my own life. We sat in silence for a bit. My tea had cooled, but I didn't care. There was something oddly comforting about being that still beside him. I said eventually, I've had my share of restarts too. Different kind, maybe, but no less confusing. He turned toward me slightly. "You're married." "Widowed," I said, a soft note in my voice. 10 years ago. Thomas passed suddenly. Heart attack. One moment we were laughing about dinner. The next, well, everything changed. He looked down, brows furrowed. "I'm sorry." "It's all right. Time changes how it hurts. It doesn't erase it, just softens the edges." He nodded slowly, and for a few seconds we both stared at the sky, now turning dusky with streaks of orange and lavender. It felt good, speaking truths without judgment, like finding a new rhythm with someone you didn't expect. "What did you use to love before everything went sideways?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. He blinked, taken aback. "Love? Yeah. Hobbies. Passions. Something that made you feel alive before it all got buried under life." He thought about it, and I watched his face shift as the memories surfaced. "I used to write," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Poetry. Just little things. Never shared them with anyone." "Why not?" "I don't know. Maybe I didn't think they were good enough. Maybe I didn't think I was." That last sentence sat between us like a fragile thing. "You should start again," I said gently. He turned to me, eyes surprised. "You think?" "I do. Writing is a kind of healing, I believe. It was for me. I used to keep journals after Thomas passed. Not elegant prose, just fragments, thoughts. Grief doesn't always come in full sentences." A breeze passed again, this one cooler. He rubbed his hands together, not quite from cold. "Would it be all right," he asked, voice lower now, "if I came by again sometime? Just to talk. I don't have many people I can talk to without feeling like I'm being graded." I gave him a warm smile. "Of course. This porch has no rules, Dennis." He looked relieved, and maybe a bit lighter. We said goodnight shortly after, and I watched him cross the street, shoulders just a little straighter. That night I went inside with a strange warmth in my chest. It wasn't romantic, not quite. It wasn't pity either. It was connection. Unexpected, unforced. The kind you don't see coming, but recognize immediately when it's there. And something told me this wasn't the last time we'd sit on the porch together, speaking truths under the fading sun. The next day, just after dinner, I heard the familiar sound of shoes on gravel. I opened the door, and there he was again, this time holding a little notebook in one hand. He didn't say anything, just gave me a shy smile and gestured toward the empty chair. I stepped aside, letting him in with a nod, feeling that same soft flutter of curiosity and calm settle around me like a well-worn quilt. It was a beginning neither of us had expected. But sometimes the unexpected turns out to be exactly what we needed. He opened the notebook slowly, eyes flickering toward me like a child showing their first drawing. "I brought something," he said. "I tried writing again. Would you read it to me?" I asked gently. He hesitated, but then nodded. And as he began to speak, something inside me stirred, a recognition of pain, of hope, of being seen. And I listened, really listened, as the words unfolded into something quietly beautiful. The way Dennis's voice wavered when he read the first line of his poem that evening, soft, hesitant, but laced with something vulnerable, stirred a part of me I hadn't touched in a long time. He read about the ache of an empty room, about the sound of laughter that once filled a hallway, and how silence sometimes echoes louder than sound. The words weren't polished or poetic in a literary sense, but they were honest. They were raw, and that made them powerful. When he finished, he looked up with a nervous glance, like he was bracing for critique. "It was beautiful," I said simply, meeting his eyes. "Thank you for sharing it." He let out a breath I think he'd been holding since he stepped onto my porch. I wasn't sure if it would make sense. I don't really know how to talk about this stuff. The writing helps, though. It lets me feel without completely unraveling. I nodded, sipping my tea. That's exactly why it matters." He smiled, and for a moment the deep lines of grief in his face softened. I saw the man he might have been before life rearranged him. A younger version, maybe, but not without his quiet strength. "Do you write anything else?" I asked, curious. "Sometimes stories," he said, almost shyly. "Little things I imagine. I used to make them up for my daughter when she was younger. She's 16 now, too cool for bedtime stories." I laughed. Teenagers tend to grow out of the magic for a while, but it always finds its way back. We talked until the stars began to sprinkle the sky. He told me about his life before the divorce, how he used to work in publishing, editorial stuff mostly. And I shared more about Thomas, about our garden and our weekend drives, and the quiet way he used to hold my hand during movies. "I miss that kind of silence," Dennis said, "the kind that feels full." It was the kind of sentence that lingers. The next few evenings, our porch meetings became a quiet rhythm. Some nights he brought his writing, other times we just talked. About our favorite books, about things we never got around to doing. About loneliness and how it shows up uninvited and makes itself too comfortable. And in those conversations, something began to shift between us. Not romance, not yet, and maybe not ever in the traditional sense, but something intimate in its own right. A tenderness, a shared space where grief didn't need to be dressed up or hidden. One evening, after a particularly emotional reading, he'd written about the last time he saw his wife smile. He paused, looking out toward the street. "Ellen, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded slowly. "Of course." "Do you ever feel guilty for moving on? Even just feeling good again?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't asked it of myself, but because hearing it from someone else's mouth gave it a new weight. "Yes," I said. "For a long time, I did. The first time I laughed really hard after Thomas died, I cried right after. Like I'd betrayed him somehow." He looked at me, waiting. But eventually, I realized that moving forward isn't erasing the past. It's honoring it. Loving again, feeling again. It doesn't mean we stop missing them. It just means we're still alive. And life, it keeps asking us to show up. His eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. That's what scares me, I think. That showing up might mean letting go. And I don't know how to do both. "You don't have to let go all at once," I said gently. "You just have to leave room for what's next." He didn't respond, but something in him seemed to loosen. He leaned back in the chair, gaze fixed on the stars. The following weekend, Margaret hosted a small neighborhood dinner in her backyard. It was her way of getting everyone out of their caves, she said, and she insisted I come. I almost said no. Large gatherings drained me these days, but I agreed. When I arrived, Dennis was already there, helping her set up string lights and carry dishes. He looked different, lighter somehow, like something inside him had been slowly untangled. He walked over when he saw me, wearing that same nervous smile from the porch, only now it seemed more confident. "Didn't think you'd come," he said, handing me a glass of wine. "I'm trying to say yes more," I replied with a smile. The evening flowed with easy laughter and simple food. People told stories, clinked glasses, and for the first time in what felt like years, I found myself leaning into the moment rather than observing it from a safe emotional distance. Later, while others chatted around the fire pit, Dennis and I stepped away, toward the quieter corner of the garden where the hydrangeas were just beginning to bloom. "I used to imagine this part of my life differently," he said. "Not better, necessarily. Just more certain." "I think we all did," I replied. But maybe the uncertainty is where the beauty sneaks in. He looked at me long and quietly. Ellen, you've become important to me, more than I expected. I don't know what that means yet, but I needed to say it. My heart beat slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I feel it too, I said finally, but let's not try to define it just yet. Let's just keep showing up. He nodded, and for the first time since we met, he reached for my hand. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music, no grand moment, just the warmth of skin against skin, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with presence. We stood there in the moonlight, not needing to say more, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a woman looking back. I felt like a woman looking forward. The days that followed felt like a soft unraveling, like life was gently untying old knots I hadn't realized were still holding me together in the wrong ways. Dennis and I didn't make any declarations, didn't rush toward labels or expectations. But there was a rhythm now, a quiet comfort in knowing someone was thinking of you, even if they didn't say it aloud. He started coming by in the mornings, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just a book he thought I'd enjoy. We'd sit on the porch as the neighborhood slowly stirred awake, talking about nothing and everything while the sun crawled across the sky. There was one morning in particular that stayed with me. It had rained the night before, and the air was still heavy with the smell of wet earth. I had stepped outside barefoot, the wood of the porch damp and cool under my soles, cradling a cup of strong black coffee between my palms. Dennis showed up not long after, holding a paper bag and smiling like he had a secret. "I brought something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You and your surprises." He pulled out 2 cinnamon rolls, gooey, warm, clearly from the bakery downtown. I always pretended not to indulge in. "That reminded me of something," he said as he handed me one. "What's that?" He settled beside me and took a bite before answering. "Of Sundays, before the divorce, before things got complicated. I used to pick these up on the way back from church. My daughter loved them. She'd eat all the frosting first." There was a heaviness to his voice, but not bitterness, more like longing with a touch of acceptance. "I miss her," he said softly, "not just seeing her. I still get that every other weekend, but the way she used to look at me like I was invincible. Divorce, it makes you small in their eyes, makes you human in all the worst ways." I reached out without thinking and touched his arm. "She'll come back around. They always do. Once they grow into their own hurt, they start to understand yours." He looked at me, and in that look there was a depth I hadn't expected, a mixture of appreciation, pain, and something gentler, harder to define. "I hope so," he said. We didn't speak much more that morning. Just sat, ate, drank, and watched the neighborhood cats dart through puddles like tiny explorers. And somehow that silence between us said everything. A week later, he invited me to walk with him. It was a simple idea, a stretch of path that curved through the wooded part of town, where trees arched overhead like a tunnel, and the air always smelled of pine and damp leaves. I hadn't walked that trail in years. Thomas and I used to go there every autumn, watching the leaves turn like flames. I almost said no, but something in me was tired of saying no. We walked slowly, side by side. Sometimes our hands brushed. Sometimes we laughed. Other times we fell into easy silence, each lost in our own thoughts, but tethered to the other by the simple fact of being together. "Do you ever feel like you've lived several lives?" Dennis asked suddenly. I looked over. "What do you mean?" "Like There was the life you lived before the loss, the one you faked your way through after, and then the one you didn't expect but somehow stumbled into anyway. I smiled softly. That sounds about right. He stopped then, gently pulling my hand to pause me too. I think I'm somewhere between the second and third. But when I'm with you, I feel like I've taken a step closer to the third. I felt my breath catch, not in fear, but in recognition, because I understood exactly what he meant. I had lived those lives too. And now, here we were, two people bruised by life, finding something new not in the fireworks, but in the quiet flame of companionship. We kept walking, slower now, our hands eventually finding each other and staying there. Later that evening, back on my porch, he stayed longer than usual. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like someone had flung them from an open hand. He sat cross-legged on the floor while I curled into my chair, a blanket draped over my legs and a glass of wine in my hand. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes on the sky. "Maybe I'm not as broken as I thought." I smiled, sipping slowly. "You're not. You've just been waiting for someone to see the pieces and say, they still fit. They're still beautiful." He looked up at me, eyes glinting under the soft porch light. "You make me feel seen, Ellen." I leaned forward, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind his ear, an intimate gesture I hadn't offered anyone in years. "You make me feel remembered," I whispered. He stood then, slowly, and stepped closer. Not rushed, not certain, but open. He bent down and kissed my forehead, not my lips, not my cheek, my forehead, soft and full of something deeper than desire. "Good night," he said gently, pulling back. "Good night, Tinnis." He walked back across the street, and I watched him disappear into the glow of Margaret's front window. I sat there a while longer, holding the warmth of that moment like a secret. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing. All that mattered was that I wasn't alone in the waiting. The mornings felt different now. Not drastically, not like the way seasons change, but like the gentle drift of air before a storm. You don't notice it at first, but your skin knows. My routine was still the same. Tea, porch, quiet. But now there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a feeling that the day might unfold with more than just stillness. Dennis hadn't come by for 2 days. Not that I was counting, but I'd grown used to the soft knock on the porch railing, the shuffle of his steps. Margaret had told me he'd driven out to see his daughter for a weekend visit. I smiled when she mentioned it, but later that night, I found myself staring at the empty chair beside mine longer than I meant to. I told myself not to read too much into it, that this, whatever it was between us, didn't need to become something defined by absence or presence. But I missed him. Not the conversation, not even the companionship exactly, just him. His way of seeing the world, of speaking truths softly, like they were secrets you had to earn. It was late Sunday evening when I finally saw his headlights swing around the corner. I was still on the porch, a book open in my lap but unread. The sight of him stepping out of the car sent something through me, a quiet relief, a recognition that I hadn't imagined the depth between us. He walked toward me with something close to purpose. Not rushed, not uncertain, just present. "I hoped you'd still be up," he said. "I was," I answered, standing as he reached the porch. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other. And then he smiled, and the tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying fell away. "She cried when I left," he said softly. "My daughter. She hugged me for so long, like she was afraid to let go. I didn't realize how much I needed that." I stepped aside, motioning to the chair. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he turned to me. "Ellen, while I was gone, I kept thinking about this porch. About you. About how easy it is to talk here. How I don't feel like I have to pretend. I've never had that with anyone, not even my wife, if I'm honest." He looked down for a second, collecting himself. "I'm not here to rush anything. I don't want to shatter this by asking for more than we're ready for. But I think I'm starting to understand what this could be. And if you feel even a part of what I feel, I'd like to take the next step, whatever that means." I felt the words settle into me, not like a jolt, but like a soft light. And I realized that I had been waiting for this. Not the confession, not even the hope, but the clarity. "I do feel it," I said, stepping closer. "It's not sudden. It's been growing quietly, like roots under the soil. But it's real." He smiled then, broad, unguarded, and I saw in that smile a man no longer defined by loss, but by the choice to begin again. We sat together, closer now, our hands finding each other without thought. There was no need to name what was happening. It was in the way his thumb brushed my knuckles, in the way I leaned into his shoulder, in the stillness we shared, unburdened by past expectations. Over the weeks that followed, our connection deepened not with grand moments, but with small ones. We grocery shopped together, strolled the trails behind the neighborhood, shared childhood photos, and cooked dinner in my kitchen, laughing when the sauce burned and the smoke alarm shrieked. One evening, he brought over a small box. "What's this?" I asked, wiping my hands on a dish towel. He opened it carefully. Inside was a collection of folded pages, his poems, his notes, pieces of the writing he'd been quietly collecting since the day he'd first sat on my porch. "I want you to have them," he said. "You were the first person who really listened." I took the box, touched by the weight of what it held. "I'll keep them safe," I promised. He looked at me, and his gaze held something stronger now. Not fear, not uncertainty, but trust. And somewhere deep inside me, I felt the answer rise. I trust you too. One warm Friday evening, we hosted a dinner together, just a few neighbors. Margaret, of course, and a couple from 2 houses down. The air was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the scent of rosemary chicken. Dennis stood beside me on the porch afterward, as the guests left and the moon climbed higher. "I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again," he said, voice low. "Neither did I admitted. He turned toward me and gently placed his hand on my cheek. "But I'm glad I do." When he kissed me, it wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was soft, certain, and filled with everything we'd left unspoken. And in that moment, I felt not like a woman starting over, but like one finally coming home. That night, after he'd gone, I sat alone for a few minutes, the box of his poems resting on my lap. I opened one page at random. It wasn't dated, but the handwriting was looser, more confident than when he first began. It read, "She listened without rushing, and in that silence, I became a man again." I folded the page back and smiled, tears warming the corners of my eyes. We weren't young. We weren't perfect. We weren't starting from scratch. But we were starting. And that was more than enough.